11:42 inches the morning, northeast of Lyman, on the dirt track between Zhuravka and Yampil. From the ground, a Russian armored column looks like routine movement. MTLB carriers up front, BMP, 2 infantry vehicles in the assault wave, 2 T-72B3M tanks shepherding the rear, 23 vehicles, daylight, no air cover overhead. From above, every one of those vehicles is already a data point. So how did Ukraine's 95th Separate Air Assault Brigade turn a moving Russian battalion into 23 confirmed wrecks in 90 minutes without a single Ukrainian vehicle ever crossing the contact line? This was the first daylight battalion push Russia's 144th Motor Rifle Division had attempted toward this stretch of the Siverskyi Donets bend since 2024. The objective was the Zhuravka-Yampil road, the only hard route that could flank the Ukrainian salient holding the river bend south of it. If that road fell, the 95th's positions inside the bend would be cut from resupply within a day. The Russian planning assumption was simple. Midday haze rising off the river thins Ukrainian thermal coverage, and a fast push through open ground beats a slow one through cover. That assumption had worked for Russian formations elsewhere on the front in 2025. Here, it didn't survive contact with the sensor network already watching the road. A $500 first-person view drone and a $3 million tank don't belong in the same sentence on paper. By the end of this engagement, they were the only two numbers that mattered. The 95th Brigade had spent the prior 11 days rebuilding exactly this kind of coverage after a Russian electronic warfare push blinded one of its reconnaissance teams along the same axis in late May. Ukrainian General Staff reporting from the period describes a deliberate effort to restore overlapping intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance orbits along the Lyman direction. The idea was simple: 2 platforms watching the same ground from different altitudes and different sensor types, so jamming or bad weather knocking out one wouldn't blind the whole brigade. That redundancy is what was sitting over the Zhuravka-Yampil road on the morning of June 2nd. The Russian column moved in 2 echelons. MTLB tracked carriers led light and fast, meant to draw any immediate response. BMP 2S followed in the main body, carrying the dismounted infantry who would have to hold the road once it was taken. The 2 T-72B3M tanks rode at the rear, which looks odd for an assault until you see why. The plan called for them to break off and flank through a tree line once the lead echelon had drawn Ukrainian fire. Against an enemy with thin coverage, that's a sound plan. The 95th's coverage wasn't thin. A Leleka-100 reconnaissance UAV flew a fixed orbit roughly 7 kilometers behind the contact line, high enough to avoid most short-range air defense, far enough back to stay out of Russian electronic warfare range. A Vampire heavy-lift octocopter, normally used for night bombing runs, was flying a lower, slower loop closer to the road, its thermal payload tuned for exactly this kind of haze. Neither platform alone would have been enough. Together, they gave the brigade's fire control net something Russian planners hadn't priced in: 2 independent confirmations of the same target, cross-checked against each other before a single round left a barrel. The column was tracked. What the Russian crews didn't know yet was that the strike had already been assigned before their lead vehicle reached the halfway point of the road. The Leleka's operator logged the column at 11:42, 23 vehicles, moving at road speed, spacing tighter than doctrine recommends, a sign the drivers were pushing hard to clear open ground before anything could respond. One detail stood out in the feed. The gap between the second and third vehicle in the lead echelon had narrowed to almost nothing. The kind of bunching that happens when a column hits soft ground and the trailing driver overcorrects. It looked minor. It wouldn't stay that way. By 11:44, the Vampire crew had independent thermal confirmation, cross-referencing vehicle count and formation against the Leleka feed. 2 platforms, same column, same numbers. The kind of confirmation a fire control net needs before it commits artillery instead of a single drone strike. The coordinates moved from the reconnaissance net to the brigade's fire control cell in under 90 seconds. The launcher didn't need to see the convoy. It needed coordinates, a priority, and a window before the column reached the tree line. At 11:46, the 95th's 152 mm 2S-22 Bohdana self-propelled guns were already ranging the lead. MTLB. Here's the part Russian doctrine hadn't caught up with. Ukrainian artillery fire control is now fast enough that the gap between detection and the first round landing runs in single-digit minutes. Not the tens of minutes that used to give a column time to disperse and survive. The first Bohdana volley didn't target the front of the column. It went for the rear. That detail matters more than it sounds like it should. Hit the front of a column and the rest scatters into open ground, easier to track but harder to mass fire on. Hit the rear instead, and you trap the front. The lead vehicles keep rolling forward into what they think is safety, while the vehicles behind them are already burning and blocking the only way out. Ukrainian artillery crews on this stretch of front have run this play often enough that it has a name among the brigade's fire control officers. Shoot the back to freeze the front. The first volley caught both T-72B3M tanks in the rear echelon. Neither survived the first salvo. Subscribe to Fury Military so you don't miss how Russia keeps trying to adapt its armored tactics to a battlefield saturated with sensors, and why, push after push, that adaptation keeps arriving one war too late. The column's response was the only one available to it: scatter. With the rear blocked by burning tanks, the lead MTLBs and the BMP-2 echelon behind them broke formation and ran for the nearest tree line. The same tree line the T-72B3Ms had been meant to flank through. From the ground, that tree line must have looked like cover. From above, it had been pre-registered as an FPV kill box for 9 days. Here's the catch. The 95th had to solve before any of this worked. For almost 3 months, Russian formations on this axis had avoided daylight pushes specifically because they expected this kind of FPV saturation, which meant the brigade's strike drone company had gone weeks without a target large enough to justify pre-registering a kill zone at all. Pre-registration only pays off if the enemy actually drives into it. The brigade kept the orbits flying anyway, betting that Russian command would eventually try a daylight push again once enough time had passed that the lesson felt stale. That bet paid off on June 2nd. The part of this engagement that actually surprised me wasn't the artillery. Artillery doing what artillery does isn't surprising. It was how little the FPV strike drone company had to improvise. The tree line orbits had been flown and reflown for weeks, the approach lanes mapped, the dead ground identified, all of it sitting unused until a battalion-sized target finally walked into it. Russian millblogger channels covering the engagement afterward called the tree line a trap. Accurate, but it undersells the point. It wasn't built as a trap for this particular column. It was infrastructure, built in advance, waiting for whichever column was unlucky enough to use that ground. Would you push the column through the kill zone at full speed and accept the artillery risk in the open, or scatter into the tree line and accept whatever is waiting in the cover? Tell us what you would have done, because the Russian company commanders on the ground that morning had about 4 minutes to make that exact call, and neither option turned out to be survivable. The FPV strike drone company began running pre-assigned orbits the moment the column entered the tree line. Each pilot worked a lane flown dozens of times before, already briefed on which vehicle types to prioritize. BMP-2S carrying dismounted infantry went first. Disabling the troop carriers before the infantry could disperse and dig in did more to break the assault's tempo than killing an empty MTLB ever would. A $500 FPV airframe with a shaped charge warhead doesn't need to overmatch a BMP-2's armor across the whole hull. It needs one weak point: the engine deck, the rear ramp, the turret ring, and a pilot who's flown that approach before. Several of these pilots had run it dozens of times in training against derelict hulks the brigade keeps for exactly this purpose. The first FPV strike caught a BMP-2 trying to reverse out of the tree line back toward open ground, the worst possible direction, since it put the vehicle broadside to the strike drone's approach lane instead of a narrower frontal silhouette. The hit detonated stored ammunition inside the hull. A secondary explosion like that does more than destroy the vehicle. It marks the position for every other drone pilot working that lane, turning one kill into a beacon for the next 3. By 12:10, 4 vehicles were confirmed destroyed inside the tree line alone, on top of the 2 tanks lost in the opening artillery salvo. A British defense update covering Lyman Axis engagements through this period noted a pattern that holds here almost exactly. Russian armored pushes that survive the initial detection phase tend to die in a layered sequence rather than one large strike. Artillery disorganizes first. FPV drones pick apart what scatters. Mortars finish off whatever tries to dismount and dig in. This engagement followed that sequence almost to the letter. By 12:30, the column had split into 3 uncoordinated clusters. A handful of vehicles still pinned in the original tree line, a smaller group that had broken further east, hunting for an alternate route, and the remnants of the lead echelon, stalled and undefended now that both tanks meant to support it were burning 700 meters behind. The Leleka and Vampire orbits kept feeding updated coordinates to both the artillery net and the strike drone company, so no cluster found real concealment for more than a few minutes at a time. None of this is complicated, even though pulling it off clearly is. A Russian formation can still move 23 vehicles down a road in daylight. What it can't do, on this stretch of front, is stay invisible long enough to cross open ground. Once visibility is gone, every advantage mass used to provide turns into a liability, because mass just means more targets per square kilometer for a fire control net that can already process targets faster than a column can disperse. The eastward cluster, the group hunting for an alternate route, ran into something the Russian planners genuinely couldn't have anticipated. The brigade's mortar teams had pre-registered that exact secondary track 3 weeks earlier, after geolocated footage from an unrelated incident showed Russian vehicles using it as an informal bypass. That earlier footage had seemed unimportant at the time. It became the reason the eastward cluster lost 2 more MTLBs to 120 mm mortar fire within 9 minutes of leaving the tree line. By 13, the brigade's fire control cell was working through a target list that had shrunk from 23 vehicles to roughly 9 still mobile, scattered across an area barely a kilometer wide. Intercepted Russian radio traffic from the period, referenced afterward in Ukrainian battlefield reporting, caught a company-level commander asking permission to withdraw the remaining vehicles instead of pushing on toward the original objective. That permission, according to the same reporting, took almost 20 minutes to come back. 20 minutes the surviving vehicles spent sitting in the open, exposed, while the Leleka and Vampire orbits made sure that wait never happened out of sight. By 13:15, the 95th Brigade was confirming 23 destroyed vehicles. The engagement that had opened with a battalion-sized daylight push toward a strategic road closed 90 minutes later, with that battalion no longer existing as a coherent formation. Mortar teams spent the next half hour mopping up dismounted infantry, who had survived their vehicles but had nowhere left to retreat to. Here's the take that will probably draw some disagreement. The failure here wasn't primarily a failure of Russian courage, or even Russian equipment. The T-72B3M isn't a bad tank, and the soldiers inside it weren't running from a fight they could have won with better information. The failure was institutional. A command structure ordered a daylight battalion push down a known kill corridor without first confirming whether Ukrainian sensor coverage along that exact road had actually thinned the way the planning assumed. That confirmation would have taken one additional reconnaissance flight. It was never flown. 23 vehicles and the soldiers inside them paid for that missing flight. This is what professional, sensor-driven warfare looks like at the brigade level. Not a single miracle weapon. 2 drones, a fire control net fast enough to act on what they see, and a brigade that has run this exact play, often enough that nobody needed to improvise under pressure. Mass alone doesn't win this kind of engagement anymore. Visibility decides it before the first round is fired, and visibility is exactly what the 95th had and the 144th's lead battalion didn't. The tempo cost to Russia's broader push along this axis runs well past the 23 vehicles themselves. The Zhuravka Yampil flanking attempt was meant to open within days of this push, succeeding, using the road this battalion was supposed to secure. With the battalion destroyed, division-level planners had to either commit a second formation down the same exposed corridor or shelve the flanking attempt for this phase of the offensive. Russian millblogger channels covering the 144th's losses in the days afterward described the unit as needing weeks to reconstitute enough armor and trained crews to try anything similar, weeks during which the 95th's positions inside the Siverskyi Donets bend faced no comparable pressure on this flank at all. A destroyed battalion doesn't just remove 23 vehicles from the order of battle. It removes the option to try this specific maneuver again on any useful timeline, and that broken rhythm is worth more to the Ukrainian defense than the vehicle count alone suggests. Is this the kind of defeat Russian armored doctrine can actually adapt to? Or does daylight mechanized maneuver simply not survive contact with a battlefield this saturated with sensors anymore? That question has been sitting underneath every armored push on this front since mid-2025. And this engagement didn't answer it kindly for the side trying to move 23 vehicles in formation across open ground. The lesson isn't that tanks are obsolete or that mass no longer matters in any form. It's narrower and colder than that. A formation that can't guarantee it's unseen for as long as it takes to cross open ground has already lost the engagement before the first shot is fired, no matter how much armor it brings. The 95th Brigade didn't need a larger force than the one it was up against. It needed to see the column first, confirm what it saw twice, and act on that confirmation faster than the column could disperse. 2 drones and a fire control net did the rest. What's harder to answer is whether this was a one-off or the new floor for daylight maneuver on this front. 23 vehicles and a battalion's worth of crews didn't die because Russia is bad at war. They died because the gap between getting spotted and getting hit has shrunk to single-digit minutes, and no doctrine memo closes that gap by itself. Only better sensors, faster fire control, or simply not driving down that road in daylight. None of this is meant to make 23 burning vehicles look clean or satisfying. Most of those crews didn't come home. Walking through how that happened in this much detail is the point of doing this, not because the details are entertaining on their own, but because the side that learns this lesson faster loses fewer crews next time.